Welcome again to this year's UK Butterfly Recorders meeting, and we're going to start proceedings by welcoming Russell Hobson, Butterfly Conservation's Director of Business and Research. Over to you, Russell.
Thanks very much, Richard, and good morning, everyone. Nice to see people are still joining us as well. And welcome to the 2025 UK Butterfly Recorders meeting. Just to say, we've had some feedback about these meetings being face-to-face more often, and we do understand the enthusiasm for that, and we enjoy, as members of staff, having face-to-face meetings as well. So a chance to meet you, as well as a chance for you to meet other enthusiasts. And we are looking at the moment about how we fund these meetings as a face-to-face event in future, because we do value them as well. We had some really great presentations last year. As always, we're eagerly awaiting the results of the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. But just to remind you that the presentations from previous years are available on YouTube. And I think one of the advantages of having these meetings online is we are able to get talks from around the UK, and think this year's meeting promises to offer the same diversity and quality as last year. Before we go on, I really have to focus this introduction on saying a fond farewell to two absolute stalwarts of our biological data team, Les Hill and Zoe Randall. They've been instrumental in developing and promoting recording schemes for almost 20 years within butterfly conservation. And I did attempt to summarise their achievements, but I think I'd go on for far too long. I think we're just all immensely grateful for all of their hard work, and it is great that they're not completely disappearing. So Les is still enjoying a role as a county recorder, and Zoe will certainly be continuing to spread the message about the importance of butterflies and moths to landowners and others in Dorset, which is great. And while it's sad to see familiar faces moving on to new challenge, clearly the work needs to continue. And Butterfly Conservation will be recruiting Les's replacement in the coming months, and I'm going to leave Chloë to say something about Zoe's replacement. And I think just to note that as we have this lull, we are continuing to accept local verified data sets and store them securely, and of course there will be a period of catching up and getting to know you and the wider recording network for the new staff coming in, so please bear with them. I'm also really grateful for Emma on her last day with Butterfly Conservation to be here updating us on the tremendous Big City Butterflies project that's been so instrumental in engaging new volunteers with the wonders of butterflies and moths. So I'm looking forward to your talk, Emma, as well. And on the volunteering side of things, I mean, a big thank you to all those volunteers who've signed up to the new volunteer portal, Assemble. The system's designed to help support all butterfly conservation volunteers, not just members, and volunteers can sign up at any time. But this year we are moving on to the next stage of developing the system, offering access to training opportunities. Plus it still gives you that access to news and to connect to other volunteers via messaging or the forum. So if you're not registered and you'd like to, please email volunteering@butterflyconservation.org. While my butterfly highlights for the last year were modest, I did witness a mass emergence of holly blues in my local park early on in the year, and then saw clouds of green vein whites flying in quite dense fog on Orkney at the end of May, which was slightly baffling. But I know we'll get some more fascinating insights from today's speakers. So I'll hand you back to Richard, who'll chair today's meeting, starting with some exciting news about the 50th year of the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme.
Thanks very much, Russell. So we're going to start this meeting with some exciting news about the 50th year of the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. Beautifully segued. Yeah, no, so it's a really exciting year this year for a rightly world famous monitoring scheme that many of you take part in and have supported over many years. So we're going to start this year's meeting talking about the 50th anniversary of the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, and that's going to be by the butterfly conservation staff that run the scheme at our end. So we'll start with Jo, I think, Milborrow, and Ian Middlebrook. I'm not sure which of you is starting. You're doing a double team, I think. Ian is starting. So over to you, Ian. Thanks.
So I'll get started. I'm just going to talk for a few minutes before I hand over to my colleague Jo. So firstly, I'm just going to scan through a bit of news related to the scheme before we get on to the real meat of the 50th anniversary celebrations. So I'm going to start by just talking about some changes in volunteers and staff at BC. Look at the number of sites that were monitored last year to see how we're rating, and then just to mention a couple of new monitoring methods that we're proposing for a couple of key species. So start off with obviously our butterfly monitoring officer at Butterfly Conservation. We started the year with Rachel Conway in post. Rachel been with us supporting UKBMS volunteers since 2021. She did a fantastic job. I'm sure many of you came across her path over those 3 years that she was there, and big thanks to her, and it's sorry to see her go, but obviously that creates another opportunity. So in October we welcomed Jo Milborrow to the team. She'll be speaking after me in a few minutes, and I'm sure some of you have met her already. As I say, she joined us in October, so she hasn't yet had the delights of a full transect monitoring season, so she's got that to look forward to this year. And then also the volunteers. So several key volunteers have stepped back or stepped down from their roles in the last few months as branch transect coordinators or wider countryside champions. So I also wanted to pay tribute to these people, to John, Jenny, Mark, Robin, Peter and David, who've done a great job in their time supporting volunteers through the UKBMS. And without wishing to show any kind of favouritism, I will just give a special mention to John Tilt, who was here before me. He started walking his transect at Grafton Wood in 1998, and he's just completed 20 years as the branch transect coordinator for the West Midlands, in addition to the many other volunteer roles that John has held over the years. So big thanks to John. Sorry to see you go, but I understand you're carrying on with the transect, so that's great news. Okay, so we're coming up to the 50th survey year. What's happened in the previous 49? So this is where we see how much the scheme has grown over the last 49 years. And as you can see, 2024 was another record year for the number of sites monitored in the scheme, clearing 3,500 for the first time. And it's been pretty much year-on-year growth every year, apart from the odd blip like foot and mouth in 2001, like COVID in 2020. But generally speaking, it's growing year after year, which is incredible. So within that, another record number of traditional transect sites monitored last year, 2,418. That's, I think, nearly twice as many as there were 10 years ago. So that's the kind of rate that we're growing at the moment. Here are the branches that have the most transects, cover the most transects, and the top three exactly the same as last year. So that's fantastic work from Ken and Andy and Bill in those branches, supporting all the volunteers. But also three new branches creeping up towards the top of the list there, clearing 100 transects for the first time. Cambridge and Essex, Dorset, Herts and Middlesex. And we'll see from the next slide, why that is, because it's this is the number of new transects that were set up last year, 294 in all, but you'll see all three of those branches up there as well. So all setting up new transects, all helping to grow the scheme, which is brilliant. But also good to see South Wales, for example, increasing the number of sites there, because we've not had that many new sites in Wales over the last few years. So it's great to see some growth happening in South Wales. And if we look at the wider countryside scheme, so not a record number, but a good number of squares, 826. It's up about 30 on the previous year, and certainly an above average year for wider countryside squares. And again, if we look at the branch areas, so yeah, Dorset at the top there, 61 squares covered by BC volunteers in Dorset, and Gloucestershire second there with 43 BC squares. So that's, again, brilliant work by Adrian and Tricia, champions for wider countryside in those branches, supporting volunteers. Interesting, completely different distribution in terms of squares for BTO volunteers. So Sussex was the area with the highest number of BTO squares covered for wider countryside with 29. And as you see, there's a bit of a southern bias on this list of most covered areas. But so I should also give props out to the Cumbria branch, where 30 squares are covered by BC volunteers. So that's certainly worth mentioning. And the second highest area for BTO squares was actually South Wales with 18 squares. So that's good news as well. So yeah, good coverage, good coverage. So the next thing I just quickly want to mention before I hand over to Jo is the development of new monitoring methods. So we look at, across the years, we look at ways to try and improve the data that we're collecting for some of the species that are not so well monitored by traditional transects. So for example, a couple of years ago, we launched the evening canopy counts for purple hairstreak. And Bill's going to be talking about that later on, so that'd be great to see. We've got a couple of new methods that we're producing guidance for at the moment that we hope to launch this year. So I'll just quickly discuss those. So Northern Brown Argus. So this is a species which is fairly sedentary for much of its life, lives in fairly small colonies, and that obviously combined with weather in northern Britain makes it not the easiest species to survey as an adult for by transect methodology. But the eggs are laid on the upper surface of leaves in full display and are quite easy to find, even when the adults are not flying around. Patrick Cook, one of our ecologists up in Scotland, has been supporting volunteers in trialing some egg counting methods over the last couple of years. So we're looking to launch that this year. So that would be a timed count across suitable habitat, looking for the eggs on the upper side of the food plant leaves. It's not a low effort method because you still need to do the counts weekly, because obviously you need to know when the peak number of eggs are going to be there, and that's not so easy. So effectively you start doing the counts when the adults have reached peak activity and carry on counting the eggs weekly until they start to fall. We take the peak count as the index for those. And then the second method relates to the black hairstreak. So black hairstreak, again, is a fairly elusive butterfly, again living in fairly small colonies. The younger stages are quite well camouflaged during the day, at least, but actually at night it turns out that they're photoluminescent. So people have been trialing surveys by ultraviolet flashlight. It's not just some of the hair streaks, but also quite a lot of moths display this photoluminescence and can be surveyed at night time. So again, the idea, this has been trialed by Gareth Tilley at University of Sussex has done quite a lot of work on this, and these are his photos. So you can see across the bottom there just how well they stand out at night with an ultraviolet torch. So the idea here is to do a timed count for larvae in the evening, starting at least an hour after sunset, so it's dark enough for them to stand out. And again, it's not low effort, you still need weekly counts. And in this case, obviously, it's before the adults come out, so you need to start pretty early in the season and keep counting weekly until you start to see the majority of the larvae you're seeing are in the final stage or have reached pupal stage. I understand that the luminescence increases with each larval stage, so the later stages are the more easy to find. So these are quite exciting. So keep your eye out if you're in suitable areas to survey for black hairstreak or for Northern Brown Argus. Keep your eye out for the guidance when it gets published in the next month or so. And yeah, get involved if you want to. Perhaps we'll probably send it out through the local branches and the branch transect coordinators. So perhaps get in touch with them. So yeah, just very quickly before I hand over to Jo, just the usual huge thanks to everybody who contributes to the scheme and has contributed for the last 49 years. And yeah, I hope you're all looking forward to going out and surveying for the 50th season, which officially begins on Tuesday. Although I did sneak out onto my transect yesterday lunchtime, and I was rewarded with 1 peacock. So go me. So yeah. So thanks very much for listening. I'm going to hand over to Jo.
Real, thanks very much, Ian. Just bear with me a sec whilst I get my screen shared. So hopefully you can see that now.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, yeah, thank you, Ian. And it's great to have joined the UKBMS at such an exciting time as we head into our 50th survey season for the scheme. So as Ian mentioned, this Tuesday is the start of our 50th survey season. So to kick off this celebration of this milestone year, I'm going to talk this morning a little bit about some of the facts and figures from the last 49 years. Then we'll take a look at some of the volunteer surveyors that work so hard to make the scheme possible. We'll have a quick roundup of all the findings and some of the scientific research that the scheme's contributed to. And then I'll talk about how you can get involved in the 50th anniversary celebrations. So I thought we'd start by looking at where it all began. The scheme began in 1976, and the method was developed by Ernie Pollard and colleagues at the Institute for Terrestrial Ecology, which is now UKCEH, at Monkswood in Cambridgeshire, shown on the map. And the first official walk for the scheme was carried out that April at Pottonwood National Nature Reserve in Bedfordshire. In that first year, a total of 36 transects were walked, and these were scattered across England and Wales, mostly on nature reserves. Transects in Scotland were set up the following year in 1977, where 6 sites started walks, and several more followed the next year, and many of those have been surveyed every year since then. And then in Northern Ireland, the first transect to be set up was Murlock National Nature Reserve, and that started in 1979, and that's also been monitored regularly since then. So 6 of those original sites have been monitored every year since the scheme started, so 49 full run of data, 49 years, and going into the 50th year starting on Tuesday. And a further 16 transects have been monitored nearly every year since the beginning of the scheme, so just with 1 or 2 or a handful of years missed in that whole run. So since the beginning in 1976, there's been nearly 7,000 sites surveyed across the UK. And as Ian mentioned, we've now got just over 2,400 transects being walked last year. And the transects are shown here in red. Plus we have 2,000 wider countryside survey squares. Those are shown in blue. And 700 timed counts, so those are sort of for single species. Those are shown in green, and that all contributes to the UKBMS dataset. So as the map shows, the coverage has expanded massively since those first 36 sites, and now covers the whole of the UK, so from the Isles of Scilly down in the south right up to Shetland in the north. And the sharp-eyed amongst you might also notice that on this map we've got sites on the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands where we also support surveys. So that's a quick look at some of the sites involved in the scheme over the last 49 years. Let's have a quick look at some of the stats for the butterfly species. So the UKBMS can now report national abundance trends on 58 of the 59 species that regularly occur in the UK, the only exception being the mountain ringlet. Across all those sites, since the survey began, over 41 million butterflies have been recorded, and of these, by far the most recorded species is the meadow brown, with 11 million records. So that's over a quarter of all the butterflies seen on the surveys. And the browns dominate this top 5 with gatekeeper, ringlet and speckled wood And then the whites make an appearance at number 5. Well, it's sort of joint number 4th, really, with small white. So to collect those 41 million butterfly records, there's been many, many thousands of volunteers involved doing the surveys. There's currently over 3,000 people registered to enter data on the UKBMS website. And these volunteers have completed 715,000 surveys by the end of last year, by the end of the 2024 season. And we hope to make that 750,000 or 250,000 surveys by the end of our 50th anniversary season. We've calculated that the volunteers have walked a total of 950,000 miles, or 1.5 million kilometres, and that's pretty much to the moon and back twice. So it's an incredible effort. And in this anniversary year, we hope to make that a nice round 1 million miles. So next, we'll take a quick look at some of the volunteers that carry out all these surveys. So back at the start, the transit method was designed and piloted by Ernie Pollard and his colleagues at Monk's Wood when the butterfly monitoring scheme began, and that later became the UKBMS. So here's Ernie carrying out a transect at Bevil's Wood in Cambridgeshire. And these transect walks are still often referred to as Pollard walks. The first official transect walk as part of the scheme was conducted in 1976 on the 10th of April by Ian Woywod at Botham Wood National Nature Reserve in Bedfordshire. So Ian is a champion of long-term monitoring, and he served as the head of the Rothamsted Insect Survey for over 20 years and continued to walk the Botham Wood transect up until 2015. And even after then, he was involved in the wider countryside butterfly survey, doing a square flat. So one of our longest running volunteers without any gaps was Rick Southwood, who walked his first transect at Chippenham Fen in Cambridgeshire in 1976, so in that first year. He then moved on to monitoring the transect at Bure Marshes National Nature Reserve in Norfolk, where he was the site manager, finally retiring at the end of the 2023 season. So that's very nearly a full run of the entire 49 years that the scheme's been running. Incredible contribution. The record for the most transects walked is held by Mike Slater from Warwickshire Butterfly Conservation Branch, and he oversees a dozen separate routes. Mike passed the 5,000 transect walks mark in 2024 and is still going. So here he is on the transect, kind of checking out his transect at Malpas Quarry near Rugby, togged up in full high vis, which I'm told is a requirement of the site and not a fashion statement. It's worth highlighting that many of the transects are actually walked by a team of volunteer surveyors, and this helps to maintain that rota of weekly walks, but of course also needs good training and communication to ensure consistency for the surveys. It also offers a great way for new surveyors to get involved to build their confidence in walking a transect. In 2024, we welcomed 714 new volunteers to the scheme, which is ever growing, as Ian showed with his charts. And it's great that we can support this enthusiasm and carry on building the scheme. So far in 2025, we have 130 new volunteers signed up in readiness for the start of the survey season on Tuesday. And of course, this all includes the volunteers that contribute to the wider countryside butterfly survey, which also continues to grow with 600 volunteers contributing at the moment. In many regions, there's opportunities to take on a square, so do have a look at the UKBMS website if you'd like to get involved. So next we'll have a quick look at what all this volunteer effort is contributing to, with a quick sort of roundup of some of the science. So the data set that's created by all these volunteer surveyors is an incredibly important resource for understanding changes in insect populations. It's used each year to produce the annual population trends and national statistics, which Mark's going to update us on shortly. But as well as this major piece of work, the UKBMS dataset also gets used in lots of other research. So the data are used in climate-related research, looking at how climate change is affecting butterfly populations in the UK. This has shown that migrant species are increasing in number, that the date when spring flying species first appear has got progressively earlier in the year, and that some species are now able to produce additional broods. So for example, the woodwhite only produced one brood at monitored sites when the scheme first began, but now the data show it's able to produce a second brood at many sites in a warm year, in a good year. Changes in habitat, be that habitat loss or changes in management, are a big driver of butterfly population change, and there's been major changes in land use since the scheme began, so across this run of 49 years of data. So the UKBMS data have been used in lots of research looking at this, and that's helped to guide habitat restoration so that threatened species can be supported or reintroduced, and has helped site managers to better manage their sites for butterflies. UKBMS data are also used in research into the needs of different species and their ecology to try and find the mechanisms behind those different population trends that the data uncover. And finally, the scheme and its methods are constantly evolving. There's new field methods being researched and introduced. So Ian's already mentioned two of those that are coming in this year for the northern brown argus and the black hairstreak. In all, the UKBMS has contributed data to hundreds of research projects and papers within the UK and internationally. So let's finish off. To finish off, we'll have a look at how we're going to celebrate this important year and how you can get involved in the 50th anniversary celebrations. So there's several parts to the celebrations. So we'll start by talking about some local events. So we have an ambition to have a series of small celebratory events across the UK, and we're inviting the volunteers to get involved in organising these. The events are to recognise and celebrate the work that the volunteers do and to highlight and mark their achievements. It's an opportunity to connect with other butterfly surveyors, to meet the rest of the team that walk transects nearby, maybe to see another site or transect, and to chat about what you've seen, what you've discovered on your transect. Walking a transect or a squares, very often it's done alone. So this is a great opportunity to meet and learn from others that are doing the same thing. We've got lots of ideas of what these events could be. And that could be as simple as getting the team that walk your transect together for a picnic and social event to meet and catch up. Or perhaps to put on a tour of your transect and show other surveyors around. It's a chance to get together and talk about the survey method, share ID tips, or compare the habitats and species found. Maybe a field visit to a great butterfly site nearby would be of interest to you and your fellow surveyors to see some of the species that might not occur on your own site. And for sites that need to attract new volunteers to help with the surveys, perhaps a broader event or open day to engage the public in butterflies and show them what they could get involved with. And there's also going to be some talks going on in various locations about the UKBMS at 50, linked to Butterfly Conservation's branch network. So keep an eye out for those. We've put together lots of resources to help volunteers put on a small event locally. including ideas, invitations, promotional materials, and all the information you need. If you're a volunteer and already registered on our Assemble platform, then you'll find this resource pack in the document hub, or you can just get in touch with me and I can email it through to you. So as well as having lots of local events, we're also hoping to hit some milestones in this 50th year, which you can help with. As you saw earlier, we're close to hitting the 1 million miles walked as part of a survey. And we hope that with enough surveys taking place in 2025, we can pass that 1 million miles mark. We also hope to reach 750,000 surveys completed in 2025. So if you're not already involved, do take a look at the website to get signed up for a survey and help us reach these milestones. In particular, there may be a wider countryside butterfly survey square in your area that needs surveying. So taking on one of those is a great way to contribute. And we also have quite a few wider countryside squares in the more remote parts of the UK, which you can take on as a holiday square if you're visiting that area. So take a look at the website to sign up for some of those. They're a great way to get involved if you can't commit to a weekly transect. We are also going to be having a celebratory conference at the end of the 50th season to look back at the last 50 years with talks about the schemes and its findings and butterfly science. That's going to be in person. We're going to hold it in Nottingham, and the date is Saturday, the 11th of October. So pop that in your diaries, and we'll be releasing more information about that as the plans evolve. To keep up to date with those plans and all that's going on, you can follow our social media. So we're on Blue Sky and X. We're having weekly updates and reminders for surveyors, as well as promoting and celebrating events that you plan. You can use the hashtag UKBMS50 to tag any 50th anniversary posts, and we'll share them too. And there's going to be updates in our quarterly e-newsletter that goes out to all of the UKBMS surveyors. And as well as that, we've got a new web page on the UKBMS website to bring together all the 50th anniversary information and celebrations. So I'd like to say a big thank you to those volunteers who've already stepped forward to put on an event locally, and to encourage anyone thinking of arranging something to take that step and make the most of this opportunity to get together and celebrate this milestone. So as we approach the start of the 50th season this coming Tuesday, it only reminds me to wish everyone involved in the UKBMS a very, very happy 50th anniversary. And I'll finish on a final massive thank you to all of the many thousands of volunteers, to the Transect coordinators, to the WCBS champions, to our partners at JNCC, BTO, UKCEH, and all the BC staff who support the scheme. So thank you, diolch yn fawr, and happy start to the 50th season.
Thanks very much, Jo and Ian. That was excellent. Hope everyone's feeling suitably enthusiastic now to get out there. Who's going to walk that 1 millionth mile? Is there a prize?
What's it going to be?
I don't know how we'd ever know who the person is, but yeah, what an exciting thing. And even better news for you, Jo, is that Ian has answered all the questions that have come in during the course of that talk in the Q&A. So there are no outstanding questions in the Q&A. So you're done. Brilliant. Well done. So we'll move on in a minute. I was just going to say, kind of reminded by your map and talking about, the incredible coverage of the UKBMS across our islands, that we have people here not only from all 4 UK countries, from England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, but also from the Channel Islands and from the Isle of Man on the call. So according to the chat, so that's really nice. And at least one person from outside the sort of UK islands as well. I saw a hello from Copenhagen. So yeah, good to have some people watching from elsewhere in the world as well. Great. So we will move on. We're bang on time, which is really nice. So the next stop, having heard a bit of an update on the UK butterfly monitoring scheme, the next traditional part of our agenda for these meetings is to hear a bit of an update on the Butterflies for the New Millennium project, our distribution recording project, and Chloë Smith is going to do that for us. So Chloë, when you're ready, you'd like to share your screen.
Thanks very much. Hello everyone, I'm Chloë, Head of Biological Data at Butterfly Conservation, and I'm going to give you a few stories from the recording scheme Butterflies for the New Millennium from the last year. So as Russell's trailed in his introduction, I'm going to start with the people part of the scheme and some changes. So I'll begin by saying that we said earlier this year, fond farewell to 2 outstanding colleagues in the team, Les Evans-Hill and Zoe Randall. Les stepped down from the helm of the 2 databases, the moths and butterfly databases, which he's been coordinating for 18 years. And he's taken early retirement, but he's still, as Russell mentioned, working as a volunteer. So he's county moth recorder in Staffordshire. So we're pleased to still be working with him in that capacity. And Zoe Randall, who left more recently from her role in the team, has actually been leading these meetings for some time and would normally be delivering this talk to you, but she's moved on to take on an exciting new opportunity working with river catchments. Between them, Les and Zoe worked with the data and the volunteer community for 36 years. So an outstanding contribution to what we're all talking about today. Regarding butterflies in particular, Les recently converted our storage of the butterfly data into a new database. And also he set up the first transfer of data of butterflies in summary form to the NBN Atlas. And these were quite astonishing tasks given the number of records that he was dealing with at over 17 million butterfly records in the database. And Zoe, many of you will remember, coordinated for a decade the wider countryside butterfly survey, which has been mentioned by Jo in her talk. And more recently, Zoe's been our coordinator for the verification community and network that work in a voluntary capacity up and down the country with butterfly records. And of course, Zoe's always been a really good advocate for recording in general as well, and has been an important part of the team that support and publicise the big butterfly count each year. So I'm sure you'll join us all in wishing Les and Zoe well for their next ventures. And of course, this means there's been some change in the team. And as Russell mentioned earlier, there are some vacancies, but I'm pleased to announce that we've very recently appointed Richard Austin into the role in the team of Recording Schemes Officer. And this role is going to be picking up on the volunteer support work that Zoe's developed over the years. And some of you might know Richard already because he's been working as landscape officer in Surrey and Sussex for butterfly conservation. And he's also going to bring to the role a wealth of experience of working with and developing volunteer networks at other charities. So hopefully you'll be all meeting Richard soon, and we're looking forward to welcoming him to the team and to the volunteer network as soon as we can. So onto the volunteer network, I'd like to take a moment to just give a huge thanks to the many, many volunteers who are working up and down the country, as you can see from the map there, and also including the Isle of Man and Channel Islands. And they've just given tireless support to the scheme over the last year, as always, nurturing local recording, processing and checking records, collating those into the local databases, and the scheme just couldn't operate without the efforts and experience and skills that you bring. And thank you too for your patience during this time of change in the team as well. We really appreciate that. And just to say too that during this talk, I'm going to be sort of telling you some stories about the data from the national level, but do connect with your local county recorders or branches, because they also will produce reports and stories and news at a local level, which you can engage with. So for those of you who are newer to the scheme on the call, but also as a bit of a recap, just wanted to give an overview of Butterflies for the New Millennium, or the BNM, which is the National Recording Scheme for Butterflies for the UK. And it started in 1995. And just in terms of data flow, depicted on the screen there, the scheme accepts records from many different sources, and some of the major ones would be the UKBMS, the iRecord Butterflies app, the Big Butterfly Count, and of course the many records that are shared directly with volunteer county recorders at the local level too. And all of those records are reviewed by verification volunteers in their local area. And then those that are accepted as correct are entered into the local database and used from there. But also those local databases are then collated together to form the national BNM database. And as I mentioned previously, we're now also sharing a summary distribution dataset of those data through to the NBN Atlas, which is available online for all to view and access and download from there. So now let's cast our minds back to 2024 and have a think about some of the stories from the national scheme and how things were for butterflies last year. And I'd like to start with a birthday, because 2024 was the 10th birthday for the iRecord Butterflies app, which, as you've seen from the previous slide, is one of the flagship recording options for people to use to enter data that make their way through to the national scheme. It's a free app, and it's designed to guide you through the identification of any UK butterfly and also some day-flying moths as well. And the records that are created in the app go straight through to the Indicia database and the iRecord platform, which is managed by the Biological Records Centre. And those records are therefore immediately available online for verification volunteers, experienced volunteers to check and examine and provide feedback to recorders. Last year, there were fewer recorders active on the app than in 2023 by about 1,000, but I think you'll agree that it was still a terrific effort across the country using this technology. And as the table shows there, the top 10 butterflies recorded in 2024, speckled wood was the #1 recorded butterfly through this app. So turning to the Big Butterfly Count, which is the biggest citizen science project that feeds into the BNM database and the national scheme. Last year, it was launched on the 12th of July and it ran through until the 4th of August, and the participation was good. So thanks to all of you who took part. It was almost 86,000 people who sent over 143,000 counts via the app or the website. You can see from the chart there of the cumulative counts that that sort of participation was up there with some of the busiest years. So thanks to everyone who joined in. But I think that we can all agree that though participation was great last year, the big story from 2024 was this question, where are all the butterflies? And it was a question that our inquiries team were being frequently asked. And I think we've all said it, many of you on the call will have said it at some point last year. So clearly the weather played a big part in that. It was an unsettled and very variable year weather-wise across the UK. You'll remember there was awful storms that punctuated the year. And it started in the spring for many with quite a wet but warm spring. But then for many areas, there was a very cool start to the summer. And then followed by a bit of a heat wave in August, but then more storms. So it was generally very up and down and not really that great for butterflies. So given the concerns about absent butterfly observations and also the fairly poor weather that we experienced, all eyes were on the big butterfly count at the end of last summer to really see what the results would show. And the results did indicate that the anecdotal worries about absent butterflies were backed up by the data. So there were an average of just 7 butterflies per count last year, which is the lowest number ever. And during the 14-year history of the survey, just for context, in 2023, that number was 12. There was also about a third of the reportable species through the survey which had their worst ever records during the history of the survey. And many of those species are typical species which you'd expect to see in parks and gardens, such like, as you can see on the screen. And most of the species also were counted less frequently than they were in the previous year as well. And astonishingly, more than 9,000 participants sent in a 15-minute count with 0 butterflies, which was quite alarming. So obviously we've seen that the weather was poor though, so it was a difficult year for butterflies last summer. And however, the evidence is really strong that this was a bad year in the context of very worrying long-term declines. Almost all of the top 10 most observed butterflies from the count last year that you can see in the chart there have also demonstrated long-term declines over the 14-year history of the survey. And that's backed up by evidence from the UKBMS as well in terms of the long-term declines for butterfly species. So, and you'll be hearing more about that shortly. So butterfly conservation decided that this particular big butterfly count should serve as a wake-up call. So in September last year, but on the back of the results from the big butterfly count, which are always shared in the media, we declared a butterfly emergency. And the media coverage was really strong, as you can see from this slide, the snapshot of some of the television and newspaper coverage. And this was because of the wider public dismay, the palpable drop in the numbers of butterflies that we were all noticing, and a general desire to understand what was going on and what we could do about it. So really, it was just a great show of strength for citizen science and how a survey can use that snapshot and raise the alarm and a call for action. And a clear, specific action was linked to these media stories and this alarm bell that was being sounded, which was a letter to Steve Reed, the Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, calling for the government to ban butterfly-killing neonicotinoid pesticides with no exceptions. And I'm pleased to say that a massive 42,601 people signed that letter. And doubtless this played a part in the government announcing refusal for the emergency use of the banned neonic pesticides on sugar beet in order to protect butterflies, bees and other pollinators. So it's just a fantastic example of how your records and your survey efforts can feed into this brilliant policy work and really making a good story out of a very gloomy year in terms of butterfly numbers. And your records of butterflies haven't only been used for raising awareness, so I'd like to share another story from last year about use of the data from the butterflies of the new millennium to support good decision making. So this project, which I'm going to give you an update on, it will actually finish the final bits of work this summer, but most of the work was carried out last year. And I hope you'll agree that it's a really exciting use of the data from the BNM and also the NMRS, the National Moth Recording Scheme. And it's something that can be developed more and more widely in the future. Butterfly Conservation and Natural England's Natural Capital and Ecosystem Assessment Team from that programme, with funding from the NCEA programme, are undertaking a partnership to develop a new suite of rarity and alert mapping layers based on the butterfly and moth records. And the map layers will help to support decision making for a range of policies, including tree planting and local nature recovery strategies. And there are two different sets of products that are going to come out from this work. One is a scarce species alert map, and the other are a series of maps based around land use types. Just go into a little bit more detail about how we're working with those data. In order to create the maps, we've developed new criteria, firstly, for assessing the records. So we focused on land use types that have particular pressures on them or opportunities for change. And a team of experts at the organisation have defined indicator species for the first time for open habitats. And that actually includes a range of different types of open habitat that you can see there on the screen. And also pulling out a separate list, a sub-list for peatland in particular. And also a list of woodland indicator species, and distinguishing two within that, those that indicate the highest quality of woodland, apart from the general woodland character. Additionally, the group have also defined a list of scarce species that can serve as alerts too. And we've now applied these new lists to the data from the schemes, and we're using these records to produce some alert map layers. These will be square maps, which will be released as two different types of data, an open publicly available version, and also a more detailed version that will be available under a partner license. And these will be therefore available for use by schemes and decision makers, land managers, to examine and help to understand and guide good decisions and plans. So, for example, a tree planting scheme using the maps would be alerted to the likely whereabouts of high quality open habitats and the butterflies and moths which are most sensitive to their plans for tree planting and might be negatively affected if they were carried out there. And I should also say that we're also going to develop alongside a companion data set, which will be able to be mapped and indicate survey confidence. So that will help with the interpretation of those data. I hope you agree that that's going to be an exciting project, and we'll be able to update you more in the year ahead as those layers become available. So that concludes my reflections for 2024. And what about 2025? What's this year going to bring? Well, it's 30 years since the start of the B&M. And as you've seen from Jo and Ian's slides, there's certainly a lot to celebrate about monitoring this year and also recording. So we're looking forward to doing that. The date for your diary, the Big Butterfly Count will take place this year on Friday, the 18th of July as the launch date, and then running through to the 10th of August. And we're looking forward to working with you all in the year ahead on strengthening the data and the systems and improving the outcomes for butterflies based on those data. So it just remains for me to say a huge thank you to everyone for supporting the National Recording Scheme with your recording, with the verifying and volunteering and collating of data that you do, which make all of the things that we've discussed today possible. So thanks for your support.
Great. Well, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a chance to stretch your legs, get a cup of something or a glass of something, perhaps even get outside and see the partial eclipse that's going on. It's sunny where you are, but now we're really into it's kind of often the highlight of the meeting, what people are really looking forward. I'm just going to build you up, Mark. It'll take about 20
Great,
minutes
thank
to
you.
build you up now. Okay.
I know I can bring it down.
But those of you who come to these meetings regularly each year will be aware that this is the very first place that anyone outside of the kind of core UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme team get to hear about the official results of last year. So Chloe's obviously given us a little roundup of the Big Butterfly Count results, which of course are 3 weeks in the summer and only cover a small number of our most widespread species. So I will hand over to Mark just now, who will give us the official news on how all our butterfly species did across the UK in 2024.
Yeah, it won't come as much surprise, the results that I present, and I don't want to leave everyone too downhearted. So I'm going to start with something positive. I mean, first of all, it's absolutely beautiful sunshine out here, and I've just walked up and down the garden and seen a peacock, which has been delightful because I didn't see that many of those last year. And also, I've put this large tortoise on the slide here, photographed recently by my friend in Kent, just to highlight that there were some good things that came out of 2024. There was quite a few of these recorded on transects, for example, which I think is quite a nice story. Just to reiterate, as I always do at this time, as Rich has mentioned, this is the first time we get to see these results, and as a result, we put a press release out next week. So if you can just not share these results until after that, that'd be really appreciated, because then we get the maximum impact of those results, of course. So thank you for that. We've already seen this slide from Ian, so I won't go on about it too much, but this gives me the opportunity really early on in the talk to just thank everyone for their amazing participation again, because it's quite incredible that even in a year like last year, where it was a struggle to get out with all that rain, that we recorded so many sites, more than ever before, and people are getting out every week. I know the struggles of getting out every week, especially when the weather's like it is last year, and also when you're not seeing butterflies like for so many weeks during the season last year. It's really, really quite a hard stretch. So it's amazing. You can see just there on the right, that's just a plot of the transects, the targeted surveys and the wider country transects that were walked in 2024. So a really good coverage. There's still some gaps, but we're really improving in those areas. So fantastic efforts once again. So to come on to what kind of a year it was, I guess you've all been waiting to hear this. And I think possibly this is the only surprise that I might give you, is that it wasn't the worst year on record, because it certainly felt like it was going to go that way for me. What this plot here takes into account is the rank of all species. So it looks at each year for each species and ranks how well that species did based on the collated index of that species across all sites. And it says how good was that year for that species over all years that it was recorded. And then we take an average across the year for all species that recorded that year. And by doing that, what we found that 2024 comes out as the 5th worst year on record, 45th. I mean, there's various ways of looking at this, but basically what this shows is it was an incredibly bad year for butterflies in 2024, which will come as no surprise, I'm very sure. 6 species managed to show an annual increase, which I'll show you later. Not many out of the 58 that we've actually managed to do analysis for. 51 species unfortunately showed an annual decline, and some of them quite severe declines as well. And then there was just one species, which was the ringlet, that showed no annual change compared to 2023. And actually the ringlet had a very poor year in 2023, if you remember, because of the drought effects from the previous year to that. So it wasn't that it had a great year in 2024, it just already had a bad year basically, so it didn't change much. Sorry not to be more positive about that one. And looking at the kind of long term here, so looking at how each species fared compared to its long-term average, the story wasn't much better. We've already heard about long-term trends and how a lot of these species didn't just have a bad year in 2024, but they're doing quite badly in the long term. So 13 species, less than a quarter, actually produced an index that was above their long-term average, whilst the other 72% produced an index that was below their long-term average. So I'm just going to go down this table. This is the table that we presented in the summary of statistics, showing all 59 species that are recorded in the UK, and the data for the 58 species for which we have enough data to analyse. You heard earlier that mountain ringlet's the only one that we can't do analysis on at this point in time. And 9 species actually had their worst year on record in 2024. So I'm just going to go down this list, and you can try and guess as you go down if you like, but grizzle skipper was the first of those down the list to have its worst year. Also the small skipper, and then the large skipper as well. So 3 skippers managed to have their worst year on record. Cryptic wood white had a bad year, had its worst year on record in 2024, and green vein white. Small purple fritillary again, so that's the second year in a row that it's had its worst year on record. And small tortoiseshell, and I'm going to talk about that species quite a bit in this talk because it had a horrendous year. And myself, I only saw 1 in the whole year, and I didn't get it on my transect. It's just amazing, really. Small copper, another wider countryside species that has been doing quite poorly in the last few years, had its worst year on record. And finally, the chalk-hill blue. So just to emphasise, this is across the UK, so this takes all the data that we have into account. I'll show you some country level breakdowns of some of these. So some of these species didn't have their worst year at country level, and different species did. So I'll come on to that in a bit. We've already heard about the weather, and I'm very keen to try and forget last year. The temperature here actually shows that despite the fact that it was a very wet year and pretty miserable throughout, especially down where I am in Oxfordshire, the temperatures were generally above average, and especially at the start of the year with May and spring breaking records for temperatures. It was the fourth warmest year on record, actually, only behind 2022, 2023 and 2014. So it was actually a very warm year. So it wasn't temperature that was at fault here. And I like this quote on the Met Office, actually, that says, an exceptionally warm month in spring does not necessarily mean a month of fine and dry weather. And they couldn't have put it better for this year, really, because I was going out, it felt very warm and humid, but it was just awful. I think this one about rainfall actually surprised me a little bit, being down in Oxfordshire. But then when you look at the statistics, some of the breakdowns, and look at some of these maps, you'll see that early in the year, it was just throughout the UK, there was incredibly heavy rainfall. So really, really wet start to the year, going through all the way through to April. But what didn't kind of strike me is that July, August, June weren't that wet. They were cooler, as you saw on the previous slide, but they weren't that wet across the UK. Around me, it was wet every month, and there was a local person who puts out a rain gauge, and every month it was this amount above average, and it got to a point where you couldn't actually have a dry month without it still being an above average year for rainfall. It was just that wet throughout the year. Very wet again later in the autumn, and you can see that it really was the south of the country, southern England and central England, that suffered the most for rainfall in 2024, and that really featured throughout the season. And not surprisingly, as a result of that, when we look at the sunshine levels, there wasn't really a month throughout the season where sunshine levels were above the average. A bit in June, which kind of, I can't remember June because I wasn't in the country much, so that's just typical, isn't it, that I wasn't here when the weather was actually a little bit better. But when I got back, there's certainly no improvement in the numbers of butterflies on my transect. So all in all, the weather was very, very non-conducive to both butterfly recording, so getting out there and seeing the butterflies, and for the butterflies themselves in terms of getting on with their behaviours, egg laying and the larval development, etc. So really a poor year weather-wise. So let's look at the number of butterflies in a different way. This is just the average number of butterflies recorded overall transects, averaged out because obviously we've got more transects in recent years. And in the red line there, the red solid line, you'll see that's the numbers for 2024 across the BMS weeks on the x-axis there. And you can see in the full black line is the last 10 years before 2024, just to show you kind of more recent numbers. And then the dotted line is for the whole series since 1976. And you can just see how astonishingly low that peak for 2024 was, about half the size in the critical period between June and August, and never really above, except right at the start of the season when it was a bit warmer. And if I put this into, if I just take the average number over the entire year and go right back to 1976 and plot it rather like I did for the collated index across species, you can see that in terms of average number of butterflies recorded per year, 2024 actually comes out as the second lowest on record there. And that seems like a very similar statistic to what was coming out of the big butterfly count. There you've got like 7.5 butterflies on average. And the striking feature, which has already been mentioned by Chloë, and also you'll have seen from the species that had their worst year on record, is that it was predominantly the species that we associate with being common and found everywhere and in good numbers, the wider countryside species, that really did do kind of worse in a way. You can see this, I've plotted here. So the red line shows you all the habitat species, habitat specialist species, sorry, collated together, so one composite across all of those species, and then the same in the blue line for the wider countryside species, and that's all the species that were recorded in the UK. So this is nothing linked to the indicator, it's just me pulling up a plot just to show you some kind of split between the two groups of butterflies. And you can see there, not only have habitat specialists undergone such a substantial decline in the early part of the series, from which they're not recovered, but actually in terms of 2024, it was the fifth worst year on record, just as it was for the UK all butterflies. Whereas for habitat specialists, it came out as the second worst year on record. For wider countryside species. So for those species that are common and widespread and that we're used to seeing wherever we go, or not so much anymore for some of those species. A quick look at the phenology. I don't think this was particularly interesting year phenology-wise, although it reflects the weather quite well in that early in the season here. So this is a one-to-one line on this plot. So on the y-axis here, you've got the mean flight date for those species that were recorded in 2024. And on the x-axis, you've got the average across all of the season for the last 10 years for all of the same species. So if they fall below that line, it means that they came out earlier than they did in the last 10 years. And if they fall above that line, it means that they came out later. And you can see that early in the season, species like orange tip, checkered skipper, and those that fly earlier in the season actually came out on average earlier than they have for the last 10 years because it was so warm. Even though we might not have seen many of them, they still were earlier. And then as we progressed into the season, species started getting later than the average. And it certainly felt like that for me with things like marbled white. I was like, where are they? Where are they? I mean, partly it was because there wasn't as many, but they also came out a lot later than I've known them to come out in previous years. So I'll move on now just to talk about some of the trends. Obviously, I can't talk about all 58 of them. So I've just tried to pull out some of the most interesting ones and go through them family by family, and also just to give a bit more than just it declined by this or that and try and talk about it in a bit more detail. The swallowtail, we heard earlier that the data includes data from the Channel Islands in the UKBMS. We have several transects there, and that's important in the context of a couple of species. And this is the first one, the swallowtail. So in 2024, it showed an annual increase of 18% in the UK level. But if we actually look at the England level, there was no change in the index compared to 2023. So this is just the English population of swallowtails. So there was a below average year because it didn't have a particularly good year in 2023, but at least it didn't decline like a lot of other species did. So coming on to the first big group of butterflies, the skippers, you can see this bar on the right, I usually have half blue and half red to show the species that did well in blue and the species that did badly in red. Unfortunately, most of these bars are going to be red. The group as a whole was down by 43%, and all skipper species showed a decline in 2024. The worst hit we've already seen in the earlier slide, grizzled skipper, large skipper, and small skipper, because they had their worst year on record. Species flying later in the season, such as silver spotted skipper, were down by 58%. So not a good year for skippers, really. And two of our kind of commonest species I've featured here, small skipper had its worst year on record, down by 55%. And this species has shown a significant decline at the UK level by 73%, which is quite a large figure. I don't know how other people are getting on with their transects with small and Essex skippers, but around me for years now, the kind of proportion of Essex skippers has been rising, and a small skipper now I kind of get quite a buzz when I see them because there's nowhere near as many. And last year I can't even remember how many I saw yesterday, but it was maybe 2 or 3. But Essex skipper I still saw quite a few. I don't know whether, I mean, Essex skipper didn't do that well in 2024 either, but it didn't do as badly. Another species, which is another common widespread species, is the large skipper, which had a bad year as well, down by 40% to record its worst year on record. And that's also now shown a significant decline since 1976 of 30% at the UK level. So quite worrying for our common skippers that we're used to seeing. And these are some of the species that really make up the numbers of total butterflies. And I'll talk more about that in a moment with regards to the browns. And also the whites, because they're, the common white species can often be very numerous. And as a group, they were down by 31%. But at least here we've got one on the blue. We've got orange tip, which was up by 4% and had a relatively good year, certainly far above average. This is a species that's expanding throughout Scotland and doing quite well in the northern parts of its range. I didn't feel like it had a particularly good year around me in the south, but overall across the UK, it seems to have done quite well in 2024 compared to other species. The same cannot be said for green vein white, which is starting to become notable by its lower numbers compared to the other common whites, and it had its worst year on record across the UK, down by 21%. And the other species that had its worst year, as we've mentioned, is cryptic wood white. But generally, the whites had a pretty poor year. And there's the green vein white plot for the UK, down by 21%, now showing a significant decline of 28% since 1976. But I just want to show you the common whites at the country levels. So this table here just shows you the annual changes for the 3 species of common whites, large, small, and green vein white, split to England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And you can see that green vein white did badly in England, Wales, and Scotland, but didn't do too badly in Northern Ireland, actually showing an annual increase. But it was in Scotland where it had its worst year on record. Actually, in England, Wales, it wasn't. So that's kind of behind the UK change there. We can see all 3 species have declined quite a lot. And in this next slide, I've just replaced the values in the table for their long-term trends. So again, split by the countries. And you can see for England, large white and green vein white are both in significant decline in the long term. Small white's shown a decline, but it's not significant. And in Wales, its green vein white is actually doing remarkably well. It's showing a significant increase in the long term, whilst large white and small white, in particular small white, are doing badly. And then in Scotland, we've got a different picture altogether. Large white and small white are doing well, with large white showing a significant increase, whilst green vein white is declining, but not significantly. And then the picture difference again in Northern Ireland, with large white and small white both showing quite high significant declines over the long term, whilst green vein white is classed as stable. So a real kind of difference across the different countries there. I assume a lot of that can be also attributed to the kind of habitats that we get, because obviously in England there's a lot of arable land, and so with a lot of the crops, the brassica crops and stuff, which we find these whites commonly around, especially on the edges of those fields, if they're getting sprayed and stuff, then these species are going to be doing much worse. And then finally for the whites, I've just picked on the cryptic wood white because it had quite a good year in recent years, and then 2024 was a bad year for this species, and you can see it's quite a big drop there, and it scored its worst year on record. I don't know much about this species, and I was struggling to get a photo for it, actually, so thanks to Jim Asher for this photo. That's been passed on to me to use. Thank you very much. Yeah, that species had its worst year on record as well. So as I said, the browns, which are responsible for kind of quite a lot of the biomass and the numbers of butterflies when we go out on the transects and kind of make that summer bulk up, they were down by 24%. I mentioned the ringlet earlier. It didn't have a good year in 2023. So the no change that we see here, so it didn't decline or increase compared to 2023, just represents still quite a poor year, 35th in the 49 data series. But all the other species show annual declines. And I've forgotten to highlight them on there, but it's because the Scotch Argus had its worst year on record at country levels. I'll come on to talk about that in a moment. Common browns then. So I always show these slides because I think it's important, especially when we put the big butterfly counts and the main part of the transect season into context, because these really are the species that, as I've mentioned at the top of the slide, account for over 50% of all butterflies that we record on transects. For the meadow brown, gatekeeper, and marble white, they were all down by over a third. And you can just see here on this plot at the bottom, what I've done here is the average count of all these species put together on transects. And again, I've used the same color scheme. So for red, that's 2024, the numbers there. And for the black solid line, that's the last 10 years before that, so 2014 to 2023. And then the dotted line is the whole series up to 2023. Just to kind of put 2024 into context there, you can see. And that really follows that plot that I showed you earlier of the total number of butterflies, showing how responsible this group of species is for the total number of butterflies that we see. So when these have a bad year, the number of butterflies really is quite low. And of course, that has big ramifications for all the things that feed on them and the things that rely on pollination by them, etc. So yeah, this is quite a big collapse of numbers. And the Scotch Argus there down by 24% in the UK. So not its worst year on record in the UK, but when we break it down to country level, it had its worst year on record for the second year running in England, down by 40%. And in Scotland, it also had its second worst year for the second year running, down by 23%. And although that decline in Scotland isn't significant at the moment, it's starting to look that way as if it carries on like this. So worrying times for that butterfly, another wider countryside species. And another one here that didn't have an especially bad year in 2024, but I just thought it was interesting to show this one at country level, because back in the kind of early 2000s, this went through quite a significant decline. And it seems to have picked up, especially in the last 10 years. And it showed a small decline of 15% in 2024. It started appearing in sites that it had been lost from around me, so it seems to be picking up. But when we look at it at the country level, you can see that in England, it's down by 15% and showing a significant decline. And in Northern Ireland, it's also showing a significant decline, and down by 24% and recording its second worst year on record in Northern Ireland. But then when we move up to Scotland, it's actually showing a significant increase in the long term, even though it showed a small decline in 2024. And then when we go to Wales, there's actually a stable trend. It's not actually significantly increasing or decreasing. It's just going up and down throughout the series there. But it actually had its worst year on record, down by a whopping 46% in 2024. So again, another species that's showing different things going on in the long term. So moving on to the fritillaries, nice to see another species doing well there, the Glanville fritillary. As a group, they were down by 42%, and it was the small pearl-bordered fritillary again that had its worst year on record at UK level. Looking at the Glanville fritillary, as I showed you with the swallowtail, and it's important to mention this, that we do have data from the Channel Islands, and on Alderney, the Glanville fritillary has a few sites where it's recorded. So at the UK level, this showed a 32% increase and showed an above average year there, so it had quite a good year. But if we just break that down to the English sites only, it actually showed an annual increase of 15%. But this is a species that has started to do well and has showed a significant increase in the long term. Back to the small pearl-bordered fritillary, then I think I've shown this. I definitely showed it last year, probably showed it the year before, because it's really on quite a terrible run of years for this species. So it was the worst year on record for the second year running, and that's at UK level, down by 26%. And then the English level, it's been showing a massive 70% decline since 1976, and it was down by over a third again in 2024. So that's the worst year on record for the third year running in England. But as I showed you last time, the picture's slightly different in Scotland. In fact, it's very different. So it's showing a significant increase in the long term. It was up in 2024 compared to 23, only by 9%, but still an increase. And that's a really substantial increase since 1979 of 106%. So again, interesting things going on there with these different species showing different trends across different regions. Moving on to the Vanessids. Just to highlight there that Red Admiral and Painted Lady aren't included in this because they're migratory. So this is just looking at the resident species as a group for that figure at the top where it says 44% decline. No species showed an increase in 2024, and the one that's highlighted there, of course, is small tortoiseshell, notable last year by its absence in lots of places, and I'll come on to talk about that in detail in a moment, down by a massive 64%, having already had bad years in the past. But I first just go on about Red Admiral because obviously in 2023 it had an absolutely outstanding year. It was found everywhere in rather large numbers, and I provided a table of all these sites that had recorded 50s to 100s, which was really amazing. And I also remember, so I've kept it on this slide, kind of finding caterpillars everywhere on pelletry of the wall and taking in quite a few of those and finding that they all but one were parasitized by Sturmia bella. So I wonder how much of an impact that had in 2024. Of course, the weather was behind a lot of the decline, but I'm sure that these parasites must have taken their toll given the high rate that they were affecting the caterpillars of this species. It was down across all the countries for which we can actually have enough data to do the analysis. So you can see there quite big declines, England 70%, Scotland 86%, and Wales 73%. But I think, this is a species that's increasing in the long term, and I'm fairly sure this will bounce back, or hope so. So the small tortoiseshell. I've kind of been personally worrying about this species for years because it's got a little bit of place in my heart, because this is the species that got me into butterflies. I lived in an urban garden in Nottinghamshire, didn't see that many butterflies, but our buddleias were always full of small tortoiseshells. And those first caterpillars I kept for small tortoiseshell larvae used to go around the corner to the nettle patches and collect them and rear them and let them all go. So to not be seeing this species in my garden or on my transect anymore is quite a worry, I think. It had its worst year on record again at the UK level, with an annual change down by 64%. And the long-term trend is a significant decline of 86%. And also in the last 10 years, it's declined significantly by 76%, which are big numbers for a common butterfly like this. And it might not mean much, the log-clated index plot that I'm showing you here, but it's very unusual for a widespread and common species to go below 1 on that scale. It's usually a factor of species that are like clouded yellow that are sometimes recorded in huge numbers and not recorded hardly at all because they're migratory or really rare species, not common species like the small tortoiseshell. So that is really quite a drastically low clated index for this species. And this is the slide I showed you from 2023 when it had its worst year on record. It showed that it wasn't happening all across the board. In Northern Ireland, it actually had its second best year on record. But when we plot the same thing for 2024, unfortunately, it had its worst year on record in all countries, showing quite big annual declines. And then finally, I was just interested to know, given that I didn't see it at all on my transect for the first time, how many sites actually recorded this butterfly in 2024. I've only gone back to 2015, so the last 20 years, just so 10 years, sorry, I've got myself confused there, so that we're looking at kind of when we've got lots of sites rather than all the sites at the start when we only have a few sites, and it's probably recording all of them. But you can see even back to 2015, it was on almost 90% of sites. But by 2024, it's on less than half the sites. So that's not recording it at all. So 44% of sites only recorded small tortoiseshell across the UK in 2024, which I think is astonishing, given that this is a species that we're used to seeing quite abundantly, and it's got 2 to 3 generations depending on where you are, so it's got chances to recover and stuff. So something really seriously going on with this butterfly. Moving on from the Venestas, the Duke of Burgundy here. It was an above average year for the Duke of Burgundy, although there was a 4% annual decline. So that's not as bad news for this species. And then moving finally on to the last group of butterflies, the blues, as a group down by 39%, but a few species did quite well, and very welcome to see an increase in northern brown argus there. Brown hairstreak and green hairstreak also showing annual increases. But small copper, again, another wide countryside species that used to be a very familiar sight on all transects, or most transects, having its worst year on record, down by 52%. And then chalk-hill blue, no doubt really suffering from that poor weather leading up to its emergence, coming out a bit later than average and down by 58%. So yeah, I've highlighted the small copper, which I think I also highlighted again, yes, because it was the worst year on record for this butterfly. And there you can see underneath the image of small copper that the annual change was down by over half, and the long-term trend for this species is of a significant decline of 44%. And in the past, it's been, again, another species which has shown variation in terms of how it's faring across different countries. But this year, well, 2024, sorry, it was worst year on record in England and Wales, and the third worst year in Scotland, and also the fourth worst year in Northern Ireland. So its fortunes were similar, unfortunately, across the whole of the UK. I'm going to talk about brown argus and northern brown argus next, because it's fun to put species together, isn't it? But also because brown argus, although it didn't have its worst year on record or anything, it was another one like the red admiral, which had a superb year in 2023. It was up by a huge amount, and then it's come down by a massive 75% in 2024. And it had become such a familiar sight on my transect. I was just thinking, oh, it's coming out later. It will turn up, and it just never did. And I only saw a handful all year, and they disappeared from the sites where they'd started to colonize around me as well. So it went from its second best year on record in 2023 to a well below average year in 2024. So it really did suffer from that poor weather. And conversely, the northern brown argus, a much rarer butterfly, was up by 42% in 2024. So still a below average year, and it's still a long-term decline, but it's really welcome to see this butterfly doing well in the face of so many that found it challenging in 2024. You can see that I've just split it in the table in the bottom left between England and Scotland to show that there is a difference again in how this species is doing. So in England, the long-term trend is a significant decline, and it's declining but not significantly in the last 10 years. But in Scotland, it's actually showing non-significant increases both in the long term and in the last 10 years. And also it was up by a massive 82% compared to 2023 in Scottish sites. So pretty amazing for that butterfly. So I feel like there's a lot of doom and gloom there, which isn't surprising given the weather and what we've already heard from other monitoring and from the butterflies for New Millennium and everything. So probably not too much of a surprise. So I thought I'd try and just lift the spirits again at the end. I'm sorry if I've dampened them too much by just talking about some of the exciting records which are starting to turn up. So I mentioned the large tortoiseshell at the start of the talk. That's recorded from 2 sites in Kent, one in Surrey and one in Bedfordshire in 2024. So this is just on transects. So when species start colonising, it's still quite rare to get them on the actual transect counts because it relies you going out at exactly the right time and exactly the right place. So it's nice to see this cropping up more and more. And they've already been recorded, not on transects, of course, but from the same places this year in 2025. And there was also records of long-tailed blue on the transects from 2024, from Buckinghamshire, amazingly, and from Dorset. And the Buckinghamshire site was actually one I used to walk the transect with, but it seems to have got more butterflies since I walked there, which is amazing. And there was also a record of Queen of Spain fertility from Suffolk in 2024. So some exciting things. And, the warming climate might be having some very adverse effects, but hopefully some of the tiny positives we can take from that is seeing some of these new species in our transects more often. I finished again by thanking everyone for the amazing work. I mean, it is phenomenal, the amount of transects we recorded every year. It's a really big undertaking. Just a huge thanks, and especially for those people also who are coordinating those transects. So I do a tiny bit of it myself, and it's a lot of work. So thank you to them, and thank you to all the people I work with, from CEH, Butterfly Conservation, British Trust for the Ornithology, and JNCC, and then all the people that take good photos, unlike me, and I'm parasitising them all the time. And sorry for recycling them and any people that I've missed off in the acknowledgements of those photographs. Thank you all.
That's excellent, Mark. Yeah, no technical hitches.
I know, amazing, isn't it?
Amazing. So
I've been rehearsing that more than
here today. Witness a technical hitch-free presentation from Mark Botham. That's great. Yeah. Not the cheeriest of news, but brilliant presentation, Mark. Very clear, and well, we can only hope for better this year, can't we? So
we can.
We will press on, because we're running pretty much to new time. So thanks again, Mark, for that. So now we're turning away a little bit from turning away completely from the reporting on the main schemes. To some other related and exciting topics. So as Russell mentioned in his introduction, we're really grateful that Emma Bickford has joined us today. Emma's just finished work as on the Big City Butterflies project, but is nevertheless coming along to tell us about that project today. And why wouldn't she? It's an absolutely fantastic project that finished just a few weeks ago. So Emma, straight over to you then to tell us more.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that very kind introduction. Let's see if I can keep up our good run on the tech side. I did have a little hiccup this morning, so bear with me one moment while I share my screen. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be with you this morning. My name's Emma. I'm the Engagement Officer on Big City Butterflies. So a little bit of something different about our project in London. So Big City Butterflies has been a 4-year project, generously funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And it's been running since 2021. And the aims were to help Londoners connect with butterflies, moths and green spaces, to increase recording and monitoring, improve habitat quality and connectivity, to work with a broad, diverse audience. And London's historically been a slightly underrepresented area in terms of both supporter base for BC and kind of gaps in recording in inner London areas. So it's been really great to work in that area. It's also been exploring the potential of urban settings. So we hear a lot about people being more disconnected to nature than ever, and that effect can be particularly pronounced in cities. So really important to do projects in urban areas. So there have been 3 strands to the project: recording and monitoring, engagement, and habitat management. And to give you a little idea of the project area, this is our activity map. We've managed to get a spread kind of across London. So I'm going to start us off with this short video just to give you a little flavour of the project. So hopefully the sound will work for us.
So Big City Butterflies is a butterfly conservation project that's basically based around getting people in London really interested in their local green spaces and in conserving all the butterfly and moth species that we have in London. So it's a sort of community engagement project and a conservation project at the same time.
You think that London is quite a metropolitan area, but there's actually lots of animal, wildlife, insect, plant life. Get out there and enjoy and explore nature and learn about what's on our doorstep in London.
If people don't see butterflies, they won't care about butterflies, and if they don't care about butterflies, they won't save butterflies.
I think it's really important for local communities to engage in this type of conservation, because it seems like if you're not in the field, or if you're not kind of conservationist by background, there's nothing you can do. But having walks with local people makes you understand that we all have our part to play.
I think a lot of people feel quite helpless, and a lot of young people have a lot of eco-anxiety at the moment. But there are things that you can do, and I think even just doing small things makes you feel a bit better.
There we go. So it's been a really lovely project to be a part of. And of course, London is actually a really green city. So nearly half of London is made up of green spaces. And those green spaces tend to be fairly stable over the longer term. We've got our borough parks, our community green spaces, and of course, our transport corridors and waterways that give connectivity to the landscape. So taking care of all those green spaces was my colleague Steve Bolton, the Conservation Officer on the project, who did an incredible job delivering 100 site advice visits, creating over 27,000 square metres of meadow. You can see there the sheer number of shrubs and native trees and flowers that were planted, and he also delivered habitat management training to over 200 people. So we worked with all sorts of partners, ranging from kind of friends of groups, community groups, to councils, Transport for London, and 77% of our partners agreed that their habitat management practices improved as a result of big city butterflies, which is lovely news. Steve also created this really useful resource for urban habitat management. It's a really great guide. This is one of my favourite pages from it, just showing a kind of overview of all those really important habitat features, having that mosaic of habitat with a kind of relaxed mowing regime, patches of long grass, nettles, shrubs and trees for shelter, and of course those all important food plants and nectar sources. And if you'd like to check out that guide, I've popped the link up on the screen now. It's on the Big City Butterflies webpage, which you'll be able to find by Googling Big City Butterflies. But I'll also share the link again at the end as well. So here's a case study from Clapham Common. So this area was amenity grassland before the project. So Steve worked with Clapham Common to remove the top layer of the topsoil and get rid of the kind of broadleaf grasses, and seeded it with a wildflower mix. And you can see the photo here from year one. It had sort of plenty of cornfield annuals, giving that year one colour and nectar, and then moving to kind of perennial wildflowers and all those important food plants or caterpillars in year two. There were also blocks of scrub to again provide that mosaic of habitat. And this model of meadow creation was used at many of the sites as part of Big City Butterflies, as well as techniques to kind of reduce the fertility and nutrient density, like repeated cut and collect, and replacing soil with sandy gravel, all allowing wildflowers more of a chance to come through. Steve also did a lot of planting of native shrubs and trees, as I say, including disease-resistant elms for white litter hairstreak. So big success of the project. And moving on to recording and monitoring, over 700 people were trained in identification and recording as part of Big City Butterflies, resulting in 53 new recording schemes being established, together collecting over 20,000 butterfly records and over 900 moth records. Steve produced this brilliant Discover Butterflies recording leaflet for London, and again I'll share the link for that at the end. And all of that data was of course shared with the London boroughs, with GIGGLE, so Green Space Information for Greater London, and was all vital in informing management plans, both for our partners, as well as the local nature recovery strategy and BC in a London landscape plan. So here's a little overview of our Big City Butterflies transect data for the last few years. So the most commonly recorded species were meadow brown, gatekeeper, small and Essex skipper, the small and large white and the holly blue. As expected, we saw lots of marbled whites, and also mirroring some of those kind of national trends that Mark was just talking about, like not seeing many small tortoise shells. Found lots of new sites for the hairstreaks, which was really positive. And recently as well, I thought I'd just add this in, that this is a graph showing 22 of the wider countryside species, showing that those increased or were stable in Greater London between the years of 2000 and 2022. So some kind of positive data there. As I say, this is for Greater London. There's still more to build up that picture for Central London. And here's a little table showing that broken down by species. So it's not something I'm going to go into in any detail today, but if it's something you're interested in, I strongly recommend checking out the new Butterflies of London Atlas by Leslie Williams that's recently been published. And there's a great talk by Leslie on YouTube as well. So moving on to my area of the project, which is community engagement. So between myself and my predecessor, Ellie, over 12,000 people were engaged as part of the project. And that was via school workshops, community events, high footfall events, community partnerships, and also providing volunteering opportunities from engagement events to recording, helping with habitat management work parties, and training opportunities. So put together, that was over 3,500 volunteer hours, and we're so hugely grateful to everybody who volunteered as part of Big City Butterflies, who are the lifeblood of the project. So school workshops, we mainly worked in primary schools. We did do some sessions for secondary and sixth forms, and some bespoke sessions for special education needs as well. But generally I do 2 workshops with each class. So the first being focused around life cycles, adaptations, and taking in some butterflies, moths and caterpillars for the kids to meet up close. The second workshop, we then look in their school grounds. We talk about the different habitat requirements of butterflies and moths, see what they currently had in their school grounds and do some planting. So those were a really lovely part of the project. And here's a couple of photos from some school workshops in Hackney last summer. In terms of community events, we delivered 91 community events. Those were a whole range of different types of activities, from butterfly walks and planting workshops to moth nights like this moth quiz night at Energy Garden here, and also arts and crafts workshops for adults and for children, as well as kind of talks and training. And we tried to target our work to engage a nice diverse supporter base. So I've included the figures here. For BC generally are kind of usually less than 2% of our supporter base is from a minority ethnic background, less than 4% age 16 to 34. So we really try to target our outreach, and our community events were 36% were targeted at people living in lower socioeconomic communities, 26% were targeted at ethnic minority communities, and 21% were for secondary schools and young people aged 18 to 24. Our high footfall events, so this was things like festivals and fairs and country shows and community open days and all that good stuff. So just shy of 8,000 people. Should have just talked a few more, could have got it to a nice round number. But butterfly mask making was always really popular. And we'd also do the big butterfly count, run the moth trap, all that kind of good stuff. We also tried to kind of build longer term partnerships as part of the project, as we found that allowed us to be more impactful in our outreach than kind of one-off events, and to build a really strong legacy of partners as well. So one of the organisations we worked with a lot was Roots and Shoots. So Roots and Shoots is an education and environmental charity. They've got this gorgeous community garden in Lambeth, and we did bespoke workshops with the Grounding Project, which is an NHS horticultural therapy programme for asylum seekers experiencing PTSD. So that included visits to the Horniman Museum's Butterfly House, arts and crafts workshops, and creating this beautiful sculpture of copper butterflies that was installed in the garden at Roots and Shoots. And we had a kind of unveiling event for the sculpture, and with food grown in the garden. And one of the participants wrote a really beautiful poem about how important nature is for his mental health, which was lovely. So that was the final of several community art projects that was delivered as part of Big City Butterflies. And you might have heard of the University of Derby's Nature Connectedness Research Group, as they published a report about the big butterfly count reducing anxiety last year. So they listed arts and creativity as being one of their 5 key nature connection practices that can deepen people's psychological connection with nature. So we were keen to try and include that. We also built a nice strong relationship with Wild in the City, running the Community Connectors programme every year. And that was all based around nature learning, like you can see some photos of a butterfly walk here, and bushcraft for people from minority ethnic backgrounds. And we also worked with Sustainably Muslim, who are a community interest company. And here there's some photos from a butterfly walk at Walthamstow Wetlands, and also a paint pot and plant workshop we did. So Nazia and I, the founder, both gave a talk, and then we planted some caterpillar food plants and sources of nectar for butterflies, and painted the pots. So we kind of found that working with established community groups, where you've got a community group leader who can act as a sort of bridge, has been really effective, and that it's really important that community groups have some kind of autonomy and what they want to get out of partnering with BC. I got this lovely quote here from Nazia about Big City Butterflies dismantling barriers to engagement, which was really lovely feedback. So we were keen to combine recording, habitat management and engagement throughout the project. And 2 good examples of that were our work with Hackney Buzzline and with Newham Council on the Greenway Pollinator Trail. So a little bit about Hackney Buzzline. It's a 4-kilometre pollinator corridor that connects several parks in Hackney. And Steve provided management advice, recording support, planting sessions, and Ellie and I supported with outreach workshops with schools and community groups. The Greenway Pollinator Trail is a walkway that runs through Newham, 6 kilometres put together of wildflower verges. And that's now got 4 habitat feature areas. So there's one for common blue with lots of bird's foot trefoil. There's one for Jersey tiger, a species we've seen loads of in London, with nettles. One for small copper with common sorrel. There's also one for bees that was done in partnership with Bumblebee Conservation Trust. And there's interpretation signage in each of those areas as well. So yeah, again, trying to move away from kind of one-off events to more targeted project-based work. Back in October, we also had our conference at Warslow Park, which was great fun. The morning consisted of lots of talks from our BC experts like Richard, who kindly came along, and Zoe, and our community partners as well, like councils, TfL, Sustainably Muslim, Roots and Shoots. And in the afternoon, we had workshops, including nature journaling, and also this fantastic Getting to Grips with Grubs workshop with Phil Sterling, who took us out to see these gorgeous little leaf miners in the park. So again, we tried to blend the science and the people sides of our work, and we got some lovely feedback about that. Speaking of feedback, we have been working with an external evaluator to evaluate the success of the project. And these are some of the figures coming out of that people are inspired to take action, people feel more connected to nature, people are learning new skills, and particularly learning more about Lepidoptera and conservation. And in terms of the ways that people take action as a result of the project, it's been a combination of improving habitats and gardening for butterflies and moths, getting involved with recording, taking part in campaigns like the Big Butterfly Count, becoming a supporter or member, volunteering and taking part in similar events. So in terms of the legacy of the project, Obviously, there are the resources that I've talked about. And again, if you're feeling high tech, there's a QR code there for you for those. But if you Google Big City Butterflies, you'll find our webpage, which has got our end of project films on it. There's 2 full sort of longer versions of the films that were produced, as well as a pack for families and those 2 booklets that I talked about today. Obviously, the management plans will continue. There are 10-year agreements in place with key partners, as well as the strategy documents that were produced as part of the project. Recording schemes will continue, and those really strong partnerships as well. So we've launched Community Connectors, which is our ambassador network for project partners, to try and provide a framework for their continued involvement with butterfly conservation, encouraging them to keep up all the good work. So there have been kind of toolkits going out for that, and there'll be a quarterly newsletter and webinars carrying on. So if you've got any questions about Community Connectors or about Big City Butterflies, Head of Engagement Kate Merry is your port of call for all those kinds of queries going forwards. If Community Connectors all sounds a little bit too in-depth, here are our kind of 5 quick tips for combining engagement with your butterfly recording. I'm sure a lot of you will be doing these things already, but it's well worth trying to incorporate it. We've definitely found what people see and experience, they then take action to protect. And we're really keen to, help build the next generation of butterfly recorders. So, chatting to passers-by, maybe including a butterfly walk with your transect, taking out some volunteers or a community group. A little shout out for Discover and Learn for all the handy spotter sheets and resources that are available on there. Spread the word and do book a chat with the engagement team if it's something you'd like to get more involved with. So thanks very much for listening. Do pop Kate any questions you might have about Big City Butterflies after I go. Thank you to everybody who supported the project, particularly our fantastic branch chairs for the 4 branches that make up the London region, who were the driving force of Big City Butterflies, and of course Kate. This is my email address going forwards if you want to contact me, and our Instagram and newsletter will continue. So watch this space for more future things in London.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Emma. That's brilliant. It's such a great project, and really nice to hear about it this morning. Our next speaker is Bill Downey from the Surrey and South West London branch of Butterfly Conservation, who's going to talk to us about monitoring purple hairstreaks. So over to you, Bill.
Right, okay, so that is me, Bill Downey, my name. I do a whole lot of stuff for my branch. You can see some of my roles there. But today I'm talking to you wearing my transect coordinator's hat. And what I'm talking about today is I'm talking about I've been asked to talk about the evolution of the purple hairstreak methodology. I've not been directly involved in writing the methodology, just really sort of setting up the trial, collating the feedback from our trialists, and my own walk as well, and then mapping the routes onto UKBMS once they've started. I didn't really have before very much experience working with purple hairstreaks, but I had a lot of experience working with white letter hairstreaks, of which I'm the species champion for Surrey. And that was just extremely useful. And it was a kind of a transferable skill. I could just transfer it from the white letter to the purple. So that was good. I will just go through the salient points of the point count method, which is what came out of this process. And I'll also suggest a couple of questions going forward. There may be some questions, I don't know, but I'm going to preempt them anyway because I've got 2 of my own. Right, okay. The first thing I'm going to apologise for in this plethora of very, very professional looking slides is my own appalling snaps, which I'm going to make you suffer. I am, by my own admission, the world's worst photographer. And all I can say in this photo's defense is that this just gives you a flavor of the sort of things that you see up in the canopy. So my recollection is that purple hairstreak monitoring was first mooted well before the pandemic, and my recollection is that there was a purple hairstreak training day, which I think was probably organised by Patrick Cook, at which I was not present. And then I also remember Mike Slater giving a talk at this meeting. The meeting was at Birmingham Midlands Midshires, and I remember him sort of positing that this would be a good idea. The contention with purple hairstreak monitoring was we didn't really know what was going on, what was happening with purple hairstreak numbers, and that the purple hairstreaks are not best served by the ordinary pollard hawks. And that there was also insufficient data to say if populations were doing well, if they were middling, if they were declining. We just didn't know. But there was a suspicion at the time that that populations were in decline, at least in some areas. And that being a canopy species and also a crepuscular species, it was argued that a different methodology was needed. So one that provided a meaningful measure of abundance, as opposed to just detecting presence or absence. One that used repeatable methods, which of course is what you do in a transect, and also one that that since most purple hairstreak activity occurs outside the standard recording box in normal transects, that you needed to monitor a consistent portion of the species, to a consistent proportion of the species, to really get some meaningful idea of what was happening. And that, of course, this would be sampling the canopy during the flight period and during the early evening, which is the time when they're most active. In 2021, there was a draft methodology was announced, and this was really posited on an ideal scenario, which is a wide ride like this, with oaks on both sides, and you walk it continuously recording what you see on either side. And whilst in our area, we do have a ride like this. There's a ride in Richmond Park, which was obviously planted many years ago. It goes up to the Royal Ballet School at White Lodge. In reality, there are very, very few sites like this, and you simply don't get straight lines of trees. They grow higgledy-piggledy all over the place, and you get them sort of scattered, and one may be close up, one may be much further off to the right or to the left. So this really was a kind of an ideal scenario. Much more typical is what you get at the site which I monitor, this is a photo of part of Berrylands Local Nature Reserve in London, close to where I live. This is in Kingston. And the site there has about 10, 12 large oak trees. They do have purple hairstreaks, but they're not in big numbers, and they're really distributed around the site. And this particular one here, this is as close as I can get to this particular tree. There's a pond in the front, and actually behind you can't see it, but there's actually a river. So that's as close as I can get to it. And whoops, okay, just hold on. Let's come back. Okay, so again, I'm afraid a rather not a particularly good slide. But this is the diagram which came with the 2021 methodology. And really you can see that what they were trying to do was take the elements of the sort of the standard pollard walk and move them into this sort of different context. So you had a recording box which was suggested, which was actually 2.5 below the canopy and 2.5 meters above the canopy. And then you were supposed to walk, you were supposed to move forward with that 5 meters at a time, and you were supposed to record from more or less the kind of the center of the ride. And there were very, very obvious problems with this, why this was not going to work. So we were asked to give feedback on this, and so I started giving feedback, but I also put it out to about 6 or 7 groups within my area who also gave me feedback. And of course, there was feedback from other areas as well, although I have never actually seen it. But it was fairly clear that the continuous forward movement was not going to work with hairstreaks, because you tend to see them, you don't tend to see them when you're walking forward in that kind of continuous motion, but you see them at significant points along the route. And specifically, these points really need to have a good canopy view. This is what we learned really from you know, trying to from surveying for white letter hairstreaks, that you really needed to have a place, you know, where you had a good chance of detecting them. And then so obviously the position was very important. The position was very important. Another very important thing was the position of the sun. So it actually worked much better to position yourself on the west side of the tree with the sun behind you. So the sun is shining onto the tree, and then you've got a much better chance of detecting the butterflies, and also because you've obviously got light going on there, ID becomes easier as well, because you know how they appear. They're described as little silver coins flying around the tree. That just makes it much easier. And so also when you start looking at, when you position yourself and you start looking at a tree, you don't necessarily see them straight away. It's a question of actually getting your eye in at each particular location, and it may take you know, just a minute or two to actually do that. So that was another important thing. And then, of course, there's the issue of ID. You need to be confident that what you're seeing actually is purple hairstreaks, because, of course, other species do fly up into trees as well. Okay, so another downside of this was the fact that this was, as a methodology, it was excruciatingly painful for the poor walkers. And what you basically had to do was to sort of walk along, craning your neck up to the side there, and it was it was very, very painful. Yes, and you know, so really after I'd done this a couple of times, I kind of felt I was really going a bit of a funny shape, quite honestly. And once I'd finished it, and I just thought, well, sod this for a game of cowboys, I'm not doing this. So the Bright Spark, who came up with this scheme, you know, obviously hadn't put it into practice in the field. So purple hairstreaks also fly at all heights in the tree. So the recording box really didn't make much sense. I mean, something which was very obvious is, well, you know, are we going to not count the ones which we see lower down in the tree? So that really didn't make very much sense. And then the other thing is that the design of the route really had to incorporate different sites other than the ideal one which had first been posited. So I think that was very important. We needed to be able to look at sites with scattered trees, etc. So this is another one of my chosen locations at Berrylands. And I'm viewing it from the point where the photograph is taken. Again, it's an oak which does have a purple hairstreak. Not many, but they are there. And so, you know, as we kind of devised this, as we kind of worked through, as we trialed this methodology, we really kind of felt, I certainly, and I'm sure others did as well, we felt ourselves, you know, quite naturally coming down on this methodology where you're viewing from a location and looking at a particular tree. And so this is what you record in the survey. What I've mapped here, this is my mapping for this particular tree. So I take a grid reference of the location, and then the little line goes to the target tree. So that is what you record on UKBMS. So the point count. So at the end of the first year, they came out with the point count methodology, and I was a little hacked off at the time because I kind of just wanted to get on with it, and I kind of felt that we'd given pretty much all the feedback that we could, but I think probably on balance it was probably the right thing to do. And they came out with the point count methodology, and I was very pleased when it did come out because I felt that we had really been listened to. I thought it was good. I thought it was good that we'd been listened to, and I think we had actually evolved something which was very workable, and you know, I think it was vastly better than what was suggested before. So I'm just going to run through the salient points of the particular methodology. You conduct your walks in the flight period mid-June to the end of August, 1800 to 1930 in the evenings, 17 degrees centigrade or above. The wind is kind of quite important because it does need to be quite still. So Beaufort scale 3 or less, and warm, muggy, and still are the right things. You can monitor at 15 points, up to 15 points, with mature oaks and good canopy views. Fix positions to stand in which the trees to sample. You monitor for a fixed period of time. So it can be up to 3 minutes. I actually record for 2 minutes, but the important thing is there is consistency. And then after you finished recording at one point, you then move on to the next recording point, like a normal and sentient human being, and it saves your neck as well. You only record the purple hairstreak seen on the target trees, and you record the maximum number of purple hairstreaks seen at one time, which is quite important. So that's really to avoid overcounting. So I think that was very good. I was very pleased with that, and I think that's a good solution. So I've just got a couple of questions really at the end of things which I would like to raise, I think, with butterfly conservation. So this will be 2025 will be the third year. So I haven't seen any analysis of this, so I really don't know quite what the powers that be, the great and the good at butterfly conservation, actually think of this. Is it providing meaningful results? Do they regard it as a success or not? I simply don't know. I'm really waiting for some feedback on that. And then the other thing is that the point counts in UKBMS are lumped in together with purple hairstreaks seen on standard UKBMS transects, and I'm quite perplexed by that, because I don't understand why these two different methodologies are being conflated. It seems to me that shouldn't be the case, but if there is a good answer to that question, I will give it plenty of time. So that's my presentation finished. I hope you found that interesting, and I'm now going to hand back to Mr. Fox.
Thanks very much, Bill. That's really really good. Suffering for science, I would have entitled that.
Yeah, well, I've done
about your crooked neck and misshapen form.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I was rather hoping that somebody was going to tell me who's responsible for that, but I suspect that you're probably not.
Okay, so I will. There is one question, but it's I think it's
okay.
Okay. I think it's one for Ian to pick up. Actually, it's about how to get involved going forward, and obviously you've raised some interesting questions, and I'm sure Ian and or Mark will have some thoughts on those things. They can either feedback in the chat if there's time, or to you and the other people that are taking part in this monitoring afterwards. So, but we are nicely back on time, which is great. So thanks for that as well, Bill. And we will move on to our final talk of this year's Butterfly Recorders meeting. So really grateful that Dr. Andrew Bladon from Reading University has joined us and is, well, technical issues permitting. So we might have a couple of minutes of sorting out to do at the start of this. Is going to give us a nice conservation. Oh no, they're still there. Yeah, Andrew's going to give us a nice conservation story, conservation science story to round off today's meeting. Over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. So, yeah, my name's Andrew Bladon. I am a lecturer in ecology at the University of Reading. And so what Richard's asked me to talk about today is a project that we've been running for 4 years now, called Banking on Butterflies, which is an attempt to experimentally test how we can help to design conservation interventions that can mitigate the impacts of climate change on our nature reserves. So there we go. So I'm sure you all are aware and hear a lot about climate change. Mean annual temperatures have increased across the world for the last 30, 40 years or more. And this is considered to be a major current and future threat to biodiversity. So it's something that as scientists and conservationists, we're becoming increasingly worried about. And so most of my research focuses on sort of climate change ecology. And I think that species responses to climate change can be divided broadly into one of 3 categories. So some species will show an ability to adapt. They can cope with the changing climate. They can cope with rising temperatures in the locations where they already live, and they'll probably do okay with that, at least in the short term. Other species might not be so able to adapt in situ, but they're able to change their distribution. So they'll start to track climate change, moving normally polewards or uphill to follow their preferred climate across the landscape. But species that aren't able to do either of these things are likely to suffer population declines, and ultimately that will lead to local extinctions. So I just want to talk through a few examples of bits of work and illustrations that sort of demonstrate each of these things. So this is some data that we collected 5 or 6 years ago on some nature reserves in Bedfordshire in partnership with the Wildlife Trust. And this is actually just an illustration. We collected this data for a whole community of butterflies, but these three really illustrate the point that I want to make. So what you're looking at is data on the body temperature of individual butterflies. That's what all the points represent, plotted against the air temperature that was recorded at the same time. And what you can see on each figure is that the solid black line is always in the same place, and that's a one-to-one relationship. So if the butterflies were exactly the same temperature as the air, then all of the points would line up along that black line. And of course, they don't do that. They're doing other things. So the dotted line is the sort of line of best fit plotted through the points for each species. And the point that I want to illustrate with these three is that the large white on the left, over quite a wide range of air temperature, is actually exhibiting quite a narrow range of body temperatures. So the dotted line has a shallower slope than the solid line. And this means that they're maintaining a relatively stable body temperature over a wide range of air temperature. They're sort of managing to adapt a bit to a change in temperature. The painted lady in the middle isn't doing quite so well. They're sort of tracking air temperature. They're always a few degrees warmer, but the dotted line is pretty much parallel to the solid line. Whereas the Duke of Burgundy on the right is doing something completely different. It's got a much wider range of body temperatures over quite a narrow range of air temperatures, and this means that the dotted line is diverging from the solid line, and is something that sort of indicates that we might need to be much more worried about it at high. We don't know how it's going to respond to high temperatures. So some species can adapt to changing temperatures, and some species seem less able to. The second thing is changing distribution. So this is data from a paper, not one of ours, but from Susanna Mason 10 years ago, where she demonstrated that species are shifting their ranges polewards through the UK. So the data that you're looking at is data from the small skipper, from time periods in the 60s and 70s, the 80s and 90s, and then the noughties. And you can see that the range margin, the northern range margin, is slowly shifting northwards as more northerly locations become more suitable, and the species expands its range. And this is quite a common pattern in the UK because we happen to be situated at a point where we're at the northern range margins of quite a lot of our species. But of course, for species that are expanding in the north, they may well also be declining in the south and losing ground in France or in Spain at the southern edge of their range margin as their range sort of shifts northwards. And then for the species that can't do either of these things, they're likely to suffer decline. So this is some data that was collated by my master's student, Emily, last year that she's just submitted for publication. And this was from a meta-analysis where she looked at experiments where butterflies and moths, shown in green, and ants, bees and wasps, shown in purple, had been exposed to extreme temperatures. And what this shows, it's on the left, we've got low temperatures, on the right we've got high temperatures, and the lines are showing the decrease in predicted survival of individuals, the probability of them surviving time spent at that temperature treatment. And you can see that as ants, bees and wasps actually seem a bit more sensitive to both high and low temperatures than butterflies and moths, but both groups are declining in their probability of survival quite rapidly, especially above 40 degrees and below 0 degrees. And this is exposure of adults. So these sort of survival impacts on individuals are obviously going to play out to populations. And so in a conservation context, for the species that are able to adapt, we don't need to be too worried about them. But the species that are shifting their distribution, or the species that are suffering population declines, are the ones that we need to be most worried about and consider in our conservation planning. And as I sort of just alluded to, these kind of population level responses to climate change are going to be determined and mediated by how individuals respond to changes in temperature. And so in that context, how we think about local scale conservation is really important, because we need to make sure that we can try and mitigate the effects of climate change at the local level for those individuals within a population. And this means that our nature reserves remain really, really important. And this is for two reasons. So the first is that they will act as refuges for sensitive species. So our reserves are often more diverse. They've got really high quality habitat. The species individuals are potentially less stressed in other ways. And this means that they might be able to persist for longer. So it might give them time to adapt if they're able to adapt, but a bit more slowly, and it might give them that sort of safe refuge where they can survive for longer. But reserves can also act as stepping stones. So what I mean by this is, for species that are expanding their range and are able to migrate into more suitable areas of climate, nature reserves are often where they turn up first. It's the most suitable habitat, everything else is right for them, and they can gain a foothold in a new area from which they can expand out into the wider countryside. So for both of these reasons, we need to think about making our nature reserves as suitable as possible climatically. And I think the history of butterfly conservation is one of the best examples of the fact that we've got very, very good at managing our nature reserves for species habitat requirements. So if you look at the history of butterflies of conservation concern, where people have gone out and studied what their habitat requirements are, really worked out what the species needs, and then taken that to reserves and managed reserves in a better way to increase the abundance of food plants or habitat features that species want. It's been really, really effective, and those are the species that actually tend to have the best conservation stories across the UK. And that's been sort of the hallmark of conservation for the last 30 or 40 years, that we think about habitat requirements, we manage habitat requirements for species, and that can improve conservation. But in the context of climate change, what we need to start thinking about is, how do we do this for species temperature requirements? What can we do on our reserves to think about the temperatures that we want to create, not just the habitat and the vegetation that we want to create? And one of the solutions to this is to consider the idea of microclimates. So these are small locations across any area where the temperature or the wind or the humidity will differ from ambient conditions. So they won't just be what's recorded at a weather station. So weather stations tend to be pitched at 1.5 meters above the ground, shaded, and record, for very good reason, standardized conditions. So you compare between locations, but they don't tell you about the variation that's in the environment. And microclimates are caused by changes in topography, by changes in vegetation, and by changes in shelter. So I've illustrated this with a picture on the right, or two pictures on the right, which is the same location. And the top image is a normal color image. This is of an alpine hillside. And you might expect that as you go up the hill, generally temperatures are going to get cooler. So you'd have cooler temperatures higher up than you do lower down. But actually, if you look at the thermal image on the bottom, you can see that the red colours are warmer and the green colours are cooler. And what's actually going on is that in the middle of the day, when everything's had time to warm up, the open grassland high on the hill is actually warmer than the forest down on the lower slopes, because the trees are providing a buffering effect where they're providing a more stable temperature regime. And within this, you can see that there's lots of variation, lots of blobs of different colours across the landscape. So that's still a sort of landscape level look, which you might think is relevant to butterflies, but it's not quite the scale that they're working at. Well, we can demonstrate microclimates in lots of other situations. So this is quite a simple image of some anthills across a grassland. And this may seem like an obvious point, but it can make quite a big difference to species. So you can see really nicely the shadows that are created by the anthills, and those are going to be areas that are providing cooler environments for invertebrates. It may not be very relevant to a human or to a large mammal, but for invertebrates, that can make huge differences in the temperature that they're experiencing on the sunny side versus the shaded side. And these can even operate at even smaller scales. So this is a photo that I took of a wall, the top of a wall in January, where there's some moss growing. And I hope that you can maybe manage to pick out that, oops, didn't mean to advance the slide, that you can maybe manage to pick out that on the sort of left-hand side of each mossy lump, the moss has been exposed to the sun. This is taken at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and so the frost has melted and the moss is relatively quite warm on this January day, whereas on the sort of right hand side of each mossy lump you can still see that there's frost on the moss, and that means that it must be below 0 degrees. So the two sides of the moss are generating quite different microclimates, and this is probably something that's too small even for most butterflies, if there were any that happen to be about. But for something like an ant, it would still be quite important. So there's quite good evidence that at a broad scale, landscapes with more diverse microclimates tend to be better at supporting insects, and they have a lower extinction risk. And Andy Suggett, who's based at the University of Northumberland, published a really cool paper that demonstrated this a few years ago. So what we were interested in was how can we try and create microclimate diversity? And we think that there are two sort of ways you can think about doing this. You can try to manipulate vegetation structure, or you can try and manipulate topography. And the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire, who I work with quite closely, are running some projects where they're trialing this with vegetation structure, and we're working with them on that. But what I'm going to talk about today is a sort of longer term project that we've had looking at the manipulation of topography. And this is the Banking on Butterflies project. So this started as a partnership between the University of Cambridge, where I was previously based, and the Wildlife Trust for Beds, Cams and Northants. And I'll just at this point acknowledge my co-conspirators on the project, Ed Turner at Cambridge and Gwen Hitchcock and Josh Helen at the Wildlife Trust. So we came up with this idea and applied for some funding to build some artificial features on 2 of the Wildlife Trust nature reserves in Bedfordshire. So this is Tottenhoe Quarry and Pegston Hills. The blue outlines show the outlines of the full reserves, and the centre of each of these reserves is a triple SI. They're really topographically diverse, home to lots of species, really high quality habitat in lots of different ways. But both reserves have areas next to them which are shaded in red, which are arable reversion. So it's land which was previously farmed. The Wildlife Trust purchased between 10 and 20 years before the project started, and they've been reverting it back to species-rich grassland. And this has gone quite well, but because the land used to be farmed, it's still quite flat. So we wanted to see whether we could improve the habitat quality by increasing the topography on the site. So we established these sites in 2021. We did some monitoring throughout the summer before we did anything, and then we've monitored them every year since. And then last year we were lucky enough to get some more funding together with the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust and the RSPB to establish 2 more sites down in Wiltshire, where again we did the same thing. We monitored the area before we did anything in 2024, and then this year will be our first year of post surveys. The banks were built last autumn. So what do they look like? This is one of them at Tottenhoe. So they're these giant E-shaped features, and the reason for this is that they generate what we hope will be a diverse array of features. So you've got areas which at any given time of day will provide shade to allow species to cool down, but you'll also have areas which are sunny and sheltered, so that other species can go and find somewhere to warm up. So they've got the option of something to move around. They've also got quite steep slopes, and we think this is quite important because it helps to keep the bank in an earlier successional stage for a little bit longer, because quite a few butterfly food plants are actually do tend to prefer, at least for the species in this area, tend to prefer early successional habitat. And from an experimental point of view, we couldn't create the banks without scraping away the vegetation. And so we wanted to have a control area. So at the back of each bank, we've got a flat control where we have scraped the vegetation, but we haven't built any topography. So we can look and see whether any impact that we measure is due to the fact that we built a bank versus just what happens if you scrape away the vegetation. And then for full experimental completeness, we have areas away from the banks where we have unmanipulated control, unmanipulated grassland to record what's going on there and check whether actually any changes that we observe happen in the grassland anyway, and it's nothing to do with the fact that we built the banks. So that's the sort of experimental design of the project. So on the right, the top right on this slide, you've got a sort of top-down image of one of our E's. So you can see the E shape, and then below it, you've got the exposed, the flat control where we did scrape, and then a bit further away, you've got the full unmanipulated control. And the little dots with the letters in show our survey locations. So these are distributed across the bank, every aspect, every slope, flat bits, slopey bits, manipulated bits, unmanipulated bits. And at each of these locations, we've recorded, we've taken temperature recordings on little temperature loggers, we've done vegetation surveys, we've done caterpillar searches, and we've put pitfall traps to look for ground-dwelling invertebrates. And then for butterflies, what we've done is surveyed across the entire area of each bank, but also around each bank, to look at how they're distributed relative to the features. So just before I go into any more into that, I'm just going to show you a little sort of time series of how these banks have developed. So in the top left, you've got a photo that was taken with a drone just after the banks had been built in 2021 in September. So they're completely bare chalk. And then I've been back and visited exactly the same location every year since. So May 22, 23 and 24, and the other three images of that same bank, the same one that's in the drone image, showing how the vegetation has developed over time. And we're now at the stage where actually there's vegetation across most of the banks, at least the ones in Bedfordshire. So what I'm going to talk about today is some sort of preliminary results from our butterfly surveys across these banks. So because of the impact on the vegetation and because of the changes that it's necessary to make the banks, we did think, well, it's going to take 3 or 4 years before the banks have revegetated and we can really see the impact that they have long term. But we got kind of lucky with the heat wave that we had in July 2022, because it provided us with an opportunity to go out and see, well, how are the banks responding under extreme weather conditions? Are they doing anything for invertebrates when it gets really, really hot? So we did the only sensible thing during a heat wave, which was dispatch our PhD student, Matt Hayes, to go and do surveys in 40-degree heat, which was one of those things that you just sort of have to do sometimes to take advantage of the conditions. So Matt went and surveyed around some of our butterfly banks, both early in the morning, so around 8:30, 9 a.m, much earlier than you would normally do a butterfly survey, and at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, peak survey time. And he did this both on the heatwave day, but also on normal, cooler temperature days either side of it. And he surveyed the area around the banks. He surveyed a scrubby edge that's close to them, and the surrounding field. And did this by sort of walking transects up and down, not a kind of standard transect, but deliberately trying to search the entire field and find every butterfly that was there. And for each individual, he recorded whether or not they were in the shade, whether that was the shade of the bank or the shade of the hedge, whether they were in 5 meters of shelter, so again, a bank or a hedge, not necessarily in the shade, but close to a feature, and what they were doing, and particularly whether they were active or whether they were passive. So were they resting or nectaring, or were they flying and interacting and being active? And so on this figure, what I'm going to show you is the data for each of those things and the proportion of butterflies that Matt observed in different survey conditions doing different things. So on the normal temperature days, both early in the morning and in the afternoon, Matt found exactly what you would expect. So very few of the butterflies were in the shade. because they wanted to be in the sun. It's quite cool. They're going to be heating up. And some of them were within 5 meters of shelter, but not that many. And I think 20% is probably about, across the survey area, about 20% of it is within 5 meters. So if the butterflies are distributed randomly relative to the features, 20% of them are going to be within 5 meters of it. So nothing too exciting. And in the early morning, some of them were flying, but not all that many. And by the afternoon, a few more of them were flying, as you might expect. It's a bit warmer. It's a bit more suitable flight conditions. When Matt got to the hot morning, the day of the heat wave, at 8:39 a.m., it was already over 30 degrees. And so the butterflies were doing even more than they were doing on the cold afternoons. Very few of them were in the shade still. Same sort of number were next to shelter, but they were much, much more active, flying all over the place. And really, Matt's done a lot of butterfly surveys, and he basically said, it was at 8:30 in the morning, it was like 1 o'clock on a normal afternoon. There were butterflies everywhere, and they seemed to be using the habitat totally normal. But when it came to the heat wave afternoon, as temperatures crept up, he found something completely different. So the temperatures were now between 36 and 40 degrees, and almost all of the butterflies that he found were hiding in the shade. There was almost nothing across the rest of the field. Even more of them were within 5 meters of shelter. So if they weren't in direct shade, they were very close to it. And by contrast to the earlier surveys, very, very few of them were doing anything. They were all just hunkered down in the shelter provided by the banks and the hedge, trying to protect themselves from the heat. So this is just a couple of photos that Matt took on the day, so you can try and play spot the butterfly. And it really shows that you've got these whole species communities just hunkered down in tiny little patches of shade across the site, provided by the banks and the hedge. And it's actually not just butterflies, there's also some hoverflies hiding in there as well. So anecdotally, this sort of illustrates as well the impact of what was going on in an extreme weather event. Invertebrates are using the features to protect themselves from high temperatures. And they're finding, actually, Matt did take temperature recordings from the locations that the butterflies were using. And actually, these shaded patches were cooler than the ambient air temperature. And from across all of the other data that we've collected over the last 8 or 9 years, it's very, very rare for us to ever find butterflies using perch locations that are cooler than the ambient temperature. They're almost always in warmer locations because they want to heat up. But at 40 degrees, they really don't want to heat up. And they're actually managing to find spots that are cooler. So that's sort of the data that we've got from the project so far that's processed and analysed, because, as I say, we took advantage of an early intervention of a heat wave. But what we're hoping to do next is continue our long-term monitoring. So this year is our 4th year post-installation in Bedfordshire, our 1st year post-installation in Wiltshire. And excitingly, we were also setting up a 5th site at Trumpington Meadows in Cambridge. And so we're going to be doing pre-installation surveys this summer before we build the banks in September. And we've currently got 2 master students, Rosa and Rosalind, who are doing their projects looking at the long-term impacts of the banks. So Rosa's going to be focusing on the butterfly data, both from surveys, but also some behavioural work to look at how butterflies are behaving around the banks. And Rosalind's going to be working with, is currently working with the pitfall trap data, doing all of the ID and analysing how the populations have changed over time, in particular at Bedfordshire, where we now have this beginning of a long-term time series of data. And then the next question for us, I think, in partnership with all of the reserve managers, is trying to work out what the best way to manage the banks going forward is. They're now fully vegetated. Is that the best state for them to be in? Can we maintain them as grassland like that, or do we want to do things to sort of scrape patches of them and try and keep little bits of them as more sort of early successional habitat? And that's kind of a question for us going forwards. So just to give a kind of quick summary, climate change is already altering species distributions and threatening their survival. And we need to be able to manage our nature reserves to mitigate the impacts of this. And our project is aiming to experimentally and scientifically test this, our ability to do this by monitoring the impact of manipulating topography on local biodiversity. And our initial evidence demonstrates the importance of the banks during heat waves in protecting individuals and allowing them to survive these extreme events. But I think the really interesting thing for us is the sort of wider data analysis of what's the broader impact on biodiversity. Are these features doing anything to help wider biodiversity, not just in extreme events, but on a sort of day-to-day basis? And that's something that we hope to have an answer to by the end of this year. So thank you very much for listening. Just a quick sort of acknowledgement of all the partners and funders of this project, and some of the other key people involved who've collected a lot of the data and come up with the project design and stuff. And if you want to find out a little bit more about the project, we have got a website on the Wildlife Trust page, which is there. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Absolutely brilliant, and finished exactly on time. Consummate professional. But yeah, it's really positive story, and a really interesting how these small scale things might make an enormous difference to our butterflies, especially as extreme weather becomes a greater and greater feature. I did promise everyone that we would finish at 1, so I'm not going to leave any time for questions, but thanks again. So I'd just like to thank all of our speakers from this year's meeting. So Andrew, Bill, Emma, Mark, Chloë, Jo, Ian and Russell. It's been a really fascinating morning/early afternoon. There are lots of really positive comments coming through in the chat. Yeah, thank you all for making it another excellent meeting. And thanks to everyone for attending.